Jesus said, choose the narrow way. This comes from Matthew 7:13 and 14. Good morning and welcome to 755 Live, about 5 minutes of what Jesus said. And these are soundbite versions of the commands of Jesus as we try to go make disciples like Jesus instructed us by teaching them to obey all the things that I have commanded you. And today's Jesus said, choose the narrow way is part of the Sermon on the Mount, the longest teaching that we have of Jesus from Matthew. And today we're going to be reading starting in verse 13 of Matthew 7, where Jesus said to choose the narrow way. He said, you can enter God's kingdom only through the narrow gate. The highway to hell is broad, and its gate is wide for the many who choose that way. But the gateway to life is very narrow, and the road is difficult, and only a few ever find it. Jesus said, choose the narrow way. This is something that has really been on my mind as 21 ended and we were approaching 22. Just really trying to understand what that narrow way is and how to really follow Jesus. Jesus was talking here in a series of teachings and parables and examples about what it means to be a part of the kingdom that he came to reveal. And it reminds me of a proverb, or actually a couple of proverbs, Proverbs 4:26 and 27, where it says to mark out a straight path for your feet. Stay on the safe path. Don't get sidetracked. Keep your feet from following evil. The narrow way of following Jesus is narrow, and it is difficult, and it's not easy. And the scary part of this, scary for me, is that few ever find it. You know, many times we don't want to face any kind of adversity or difficulty. We want the easy way, the microwave solution to all of our problems. But Simon Peter, who was not a stranger to adversity, he tells us in 1 Peter 4, beginning in verse 14, he says, if we're insulted because we bear the name of Christ, you will be blessed. That also sounds like the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said very similar things. For the glorious Spirit of God rests upon you when we are insulted. That's the narrow way. Then he says in verse 15, if you suffer, however, it must not be for murder, stealing, making trouble, or prying into other people's affairs. That's not our business. That's not the narrow way. That's the broad way that leads to destruction. And then verse 16, he says, but it is no shame to suffer for being a Christian. Praise God for the privilege of being called by his name. For the time has come for judgment, and it must begin with God's household. And if judgment begins with us, what terrible fate awaits those who have never obeyed the good news? And also, verse 18, if the righteous are barely saved, what will happen to godless sinners? So if you are suffering in a manner that pleases God, keep on doing what is right and trust your lives to the God who created you, for he will never fail you. Jesus said that we should choose the narrow way. Matthew 25, he talks about that at the end, we're going to stand before him and be evaluated, not by things that the world considers important, but by the things that Jesus commanded us to do. Did we take care of strangers? Did we feed and give drink to those who are needy? Did we visit the sick and those that are in prison? And Many will say, Lord, when did we ever do this or not do this? And he said, if you've not done it to the least of these, you've not done it unto me. This narrow way is the only way. And Jesus is that way. And how do we know that we're following him? Because we're obeying what he said to do. So I want to challenge you today. Am I choosing the narrow way? Are we obeying the commands of Jesus? What are you listening to? Does it sound like Jesus or does it sound like philosophy? Many times we want to follow what's most popular. But Jesus said, few will find this way. It's narrow. And sometimes it's difficult. And you might get insulted for it. And you might suffer persecution for it. But rejoice, because this narrow way is the way to life. And that is the abundant life that only comes through following Jesus. Jesus said, choose the narrow way. How can we put that into action today?